I never really believed in the supernatural. At least, not until that night in the woods. My friends and I had planned a weekend camping trip to get away from the city. Just a few nights to unwind, drink, and enjoy the quiet of nature. We drove for hours, deep into a forest I'd never heard of, following a dirt road that seemed to stretch on forever. The woods were thick, and the deeper we went, the darker it became, even though it was still early afternoon. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the sun was beginning to set. The air felt heavy, and an odd stillness hung around us. It was too quiet, no birds, no insects. Just the soft crunch of leaves beneath our boots as we unpacked. But none of us said anything. We were too busy setting up tents and gathering firewood. As the night fell, we sat around the fire, telling stories, laughing, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that seemed to have settled over the camp. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the forest didn't feel right. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, just beyond the glow of the firelight. I shrugged it off, blaming the darkness and the shadows. It was when we all decided to turn in for the night that things got strange. I was lying in my tent, the sounds of the fire crackling and my friends' quiet breathing the only noises around. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a prank. But when I strained to listen, it became clear the voice wasn't coming from any of their tents. It was coming from the woods. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt like they were calling to me, beckoning me deeper into the forest. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was relentless, creeping into my mind like a cold wind. Against my better judgment, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the ground. My friends were still asleep, oblivious. The whispering pulled me toward the trees, and before I knew it, I was walking into the dark woods. The further I went, the louder the voices became, echoing all around me. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching me, waiting. Then, I saw it. Just ahead, standing between the trees, was a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing at me. And that's when I realized the whispering was coming from it. A low, guttural voice, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, filled my ears, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Suddenly, I snapped out of the trance. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back toward the campsite. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my skin as I ran, but I didn't stop. When I finally broke through the tree line and reached the tents, the whispering stopped. The figure was gone, and the forest was silent once again. I collapsed by the dying fire, my heart racing. My friends were still asleep, completely unaware of what had just happened. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when morning came, I packed up my gear and left without saying a word. I don't know what I saw in those woods, and I don't care to find out. All I know is, I'll never go camping again. I always thought of myself as an experienced camper. I'd been to dozens of places, far off the beaten path, places few others would dare to go. So, when I found an old, unmarked trail on a map, leading deep into a forest reserve, I couldn't resist the temptation. The trail looked perfect, remote, untouched, and isolated. Exactly the kind of place I craved for some solitude. I packed my gear and drove out early in the morning, determined to make the most of my weekend. The drive was long, the roads turning into gravel and then fading into nothing as I approached the edge of the woods. I had to park the car and continue on foot, following the faint trail deeper into the forest. After hours of hiking, I came upon what I'd been looking for, a secluded clearing surrounded by towering trees. It was beautiful, but strange. The area felt abandoned. Almost too perfect, like no one had set foot here in years. There was no sign of human presence. No trash, no broken branches, no footprints. It was as if the place had been forgotten by time. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, with a view of the dense forest beyond. As I worked, I noticed something odd. There were stone structures, small, weathered, barely more than ruins, scattered around the clearing. They were covered in moss and half buried under the dirt and leaves. At first, I thought they were old fire pits, maybe left behind by campers from long ago. But as I looked closer, I realized they didn't make sense. They were arranged in a strange pattern, like a ring, and each stone had faint carvings on them that I couldn't quite make out. Still, I brushed it off. I'd seen plenty of strange things in the wilderness. Maybe it was some kind of ancient marker or memorial, forgotten over time. I wasn't superstitious, so I didn't think much of it. As the sun began to set, I built a small fire and cooked dinner, enjoying the silence of the woods. But as darkness fell, that silence started to feel oppressive. There were no usual sounds, no insects, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just silence. It was unnerving. I tried to sleep, but something about the campsite made me restless. Hours passed, and I was still wide awake, lying in my tent, staring at the thin fabric above me. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a soft scraping noise. It sounded like something was moving just outside my tent, dragging across the ground. I held my breath, listening. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I sat up, my heart racing. The fire outside had burned low, casting faint flickers of light. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peeked out. The first thing I noticed was the stone structures. In the dim firelight, they looked different, larger somehow, more defined. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were figures standing around them. Pale, gaunt figures, barely human, their bodies twisted and elongated, their eyes reflecting the dying embers. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at the stones. But then, as if sensing me, one of them slowly turned its head in my direction. Its face was stretched and hollow, skin pulled tight over bone, and its mouth was hanging open, as if in a silent scream. Panic surged through me. I backed into the tent, fumbling for my flashlight. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam of light shot out into the darkness. But the figures were gone. The stones were as they had been before, small, unassuming, just ruins. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, keeping it alive until dawn. I didn't dare close my eyes. When morning came, I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and got out of there, never looking back. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched me all night. Something from the forest, something old, forgotten, and patient. And whatever it wasn't bound to that campsite. I've never told anyone about that trip. And I'll never go back there. Some places, I think, are meant to be left forgotten. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my girlfriend, and our two best friends, Eric and Sam. We wanted to get out of the city, away from everything, and the forest seemed like the perfect place to do it. Eric had found a spot online, a campsite way off in the wilderness, surrounded by miles of untouched forest. No cell service, no other people. Perfect for a quiet escape. We arrived in the late afternoon, set up our tents, and started a fire. The atmosphere was peaceful, the air crisp and cool, with the occasional rustling of the trees around us. The forest seemed alive, but not in a threatening way, at least not yet. As the sun set, we all sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. I noticed that, every now and then, Sam would glance over his shoulder, into the darkness behind us. At first, I thought nothing of it. But as the evening wore on, it became clear that he was getting uncomfortable. "What's up, Sam?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. I don't know, man, he said, his voice low. It feels like someone's watching us. We all laughed it off. We were deep in the woods, after all. It was probably just nerves. But as the night went on, that feeling of being watched started creeping in on me too. I couldn't shake it, like there were eyes in the trees, hidden just beyond the reach of our firelight. Eventually, we all went to bed. I thought I'd be able to sleep, but as soon as I lay down, I heard something. At first, it was faint, a soft, shuffling noise coming from the woods. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer. But then it happened again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was circling our campsite. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. But then I heard something else. A whisper. Low and almost unintelligible, like wind moving through the leaves. But it wasn't the wind. There were words in it, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. My heart was racing, but I didn't want to freak everyone out, so I kept quiet. I figured it would pass, whatever it was. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to sleep, but the whispers kept coming, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. At some point in the early morning, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to sunlight. The campsite was quiet, the fire long dead. But Sam was gone. We called his name, but there was no answer. His tent was empty, his backpack still there. At first, we thought maybe he'd gone to collect firewood or take a walk, but after an hour of searching the surrounding woods, we started to panic. Eric suggested we split up and search further, but I refused. Something didn't feel right. My girlfriend, Sarah, was trembling beside me, clutching my arm. The same feeling from the night before, of being watched, was stronger than ever. We decided to pack up and leave, hoping we'd find Sam on the way out. As we hurriedly threw our gear into our backpacks, Sarah froze, staring into the trees. Her face went pale, and she pointed shakily. "What is that?" I followed her gaze, and my blood turned to ice. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the morning light, were eyes. Dozens of them. Wide, pale, and unblinking, staring at us from the shadows between the trees. They didn't belong to animals. They were too high off the ground, too human-like, but there were too many of them. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We grabbed what we could and ran, leaving most of our gear behind. The whole time, I could feel those eyes on us, tracking our every step as we bolted down the trail. We never found Sam. When we got back to the nearest town, we called the authorities. They searched the area for days, but found no trace of him. No footprints, no gear, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I still don't know what was out there in those woods, watching us from the trees. But I'll never go back to find out. We were drawn to Cold Creek by a story. A local legend about a man who disappeared in the woods decades ago, never to be seen again. The story went that he was a prospector, searching for gold in the hills surrounding the creek. One night, after making camp, he wandered off into the woods and never returned. Some say his ghost still haunts the area, leading people into the forest, never to be found again. It sounded like the perfect spot for our camping trip. We were a group of 5, me, my girlfriend Lisa, and our friends Mike, Jess, and Tom. We were all into ghost stories and urban legends, so Cold Creek seemed like the ideal destination for a weekend of adventure and a few scares. The drive out was uneventful, and we reached the site just before sunset. The creek itself was beautiful, with crystal clear water cutting through the dense forest, but there was an eerie stillness in the air. It was colder than we expected for late summer, and as soon as we arrived, a strange fog began creeping in, rising from the creek and wrapping itself around the trees. We set up camp near the water, joking about the legend and daring each other to explore the woods after dark. As the sun sank below the horizon, the temperature dropped even further. Our fire crackled and hissed, but it did little to chase away the biting chill. After dinner, we sat around the fire, telling ghost stories, but the mood was off. Every so often, one of us would glance into the woods as if hearing something. A branch snapping, a rustle in the leaves, the sound of footsteps. But no one said anything. Maybe we didn't want to admit we were starting to feel uneasy. As the night wore on, the fog grew thicker, creeping closer to our camp. It was unnaturally dense, and every time the fire flickered, I thought I saw shapes moving within it. Lisa must have noticed it too, because she grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you see that?" I strained my eyes, trying to focus. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the firelight. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Probably just the fog," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We decided to call it a night, but none of us slept well. I kept waking up, certain I heard something moving outside the tent. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the camp. Every time I looked out, though, there was nothing but the thick fog swirling around us. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, footsteps, this time louder, closer. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped, and then I heard a voice. Faint, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Come, follow me." I jolted upright. It sounded like it came from the creek. I shook Lisa awake, and she heard it too. Then I noticed something even stranger. Tom's tent was open, and he was gone. We rushed over to his tent, calling his name, but there was no answer. His gear was still inside, but he wasn't there. Mike and Jess woke up, confused and scared, and we all started searching, calling out into the fog. But the only response was silence. Desperation set in. We grabbed our flashlights and fanned out, sticking close to the creek. The fog was so thick by now that we could barely see a few feet in front of us. Then, just as I was about to call it quits, I saw him. Tom was standing in the middle of the creek, waist deep in the freezing water, staring straight ahead. His eyes were wide, unfocused, as if he was in a trance. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. "Tom!" I shouted, rushing toward the water. But as I got closer, he started walking deeper into the creek, like he didn't even hear me. I waded into the freezing water, grabbing him by the arm. "Tom, snap out of it! What are you doing?" He blinked, as if waking from a dream, and looked at me with this strange, distant expression. "He's here," he muttered. "He's been watching us all night." We dragged Tom back to the shore, shivering and confused. He didn't remember walking into the creek. All he could say was that he heard a voice calling him, leading him toward the water. The rest of the night was a blur. We packed up and left as soon as the sun came up, leaving most of our gear behind. We didn't talk much on the way home. None of us wanted to admit what we thought had happened. I don't know if the legend of Cold Creek is true, but something was out there that night. Something that wanted us to follow it into the fog and disappear, just like the prospector all those years ago. We never went back to Cold Creek. Some places are better left alone. I'd heard about the lake from an old friend, one who was into remote camping spots far away from civilization. He'd only been there once and told me it was unlike any place he'd ever seen. Perfectly still waters, surrounded by dense trees, and a kind of quiet you can't find anywhere else. He said it was beautiful, but something about the way he hesitated when describing it made me curious. He never went back. So naturally, I had to check it out for myself. I convinced my girlfriend, Rachel, and our friends, Ethan and Julia, to come along for the weekend. We all loved the outdoors, and a secluded lake sounded like the perfect place to escape the noise of the city. We packed up our gear and headed out early Saturday morning. The drive was long, taking us deeper into the woods than any of us had expected. The road turned to gravel, then dirt, and eventually became little more than a trail. By the time we reached the lake, it was mid-afternoon, and the sun was already beginning to sink behind the thick canopy of trees. The lake was everything my friend had described, calm, pristine, and surrounded by towering pines. But it was the silence that struck me. There were no birds, no insects, not even the wind rustling the trees. It was as if the entire area had been wrapped in some kind of invisible blanket, muting all sound. "Wow, this place is quiet," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper, like she was afraid to break the stillness. We set up camp near the shore, and despite the eerie silence, we all tried to enjoy the beauty of the place. As evening fell, we built a fire and cooked dinner, but the quiet weighed on us. Every laugh, every word felt too loud, out of place, like we were intruding on something. It was around midnight when things got strange. We were sitting around the fire, talking about what we wanted to do the next day, when Ethan suddenly stood up and stared out toward the lake. "What's up?" I asked, following his gaze. He didn't answer at first. His eyes were locked on the water, which reflected the moonlight like a sheet of glass. Then, finally, he spoke. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Julia asked, looking confused. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. It sounded like something moving in the water." We all went quiet, listening. The lake was still, undisturbed. Not even a ripple. After a minute, we laughed it off, assuming it was just Ethan's imagination, and went back to our conversation. But a part of me couldn't shake the unease that had settled over us since we arrived. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. We crawled into our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. The silence outside felt unnatural, oppressive, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was something much worse. It was footsteps. I froze, listening as they slowly circled the campsite. They were light, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking was trying not to be heard. I held my breath, straining to hear through the fabric of the tent. The footsteps paused, then resumed, this time heading toward the water. I glanced over at Rachel. She was still asleep, oblivious to the sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I carefully unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. The moonlight reflected off the lake, casting an eerie glow over the shoreline. I scanned the area, but I didn't see anyone. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint shadows across the ground. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure was standing at the edge of the water, just barely visible in the pale light. It was tall, with long, thin limbs, and it was facing the lake, completely still. I wanted to call out, to warn the others, but something in the back of my mind told me to stay quiet. I watched, my breath shallow, as the figure slowly stepped into the water. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was being pulled in. Within seconds, it was waist deep, then chest deep, until only its head was visible above the surface. And then, with one final, jerking motion, it disappeared beneath the water, leaving no trace behind. I scrambled back into the tent, shaking Rachel awake. "We need to go," I whispered urgently. "Now." "What?" "Why?" she mumbled, groggy and confused. "There's something in the lake. We have to leave." It didn't take much convincing once she saw the fear in my eyes. We woke Ethan and Julia, packed up what little we could in the dark, and left the campsite behind, not bothering to look back. We never talked about what I saw that night, and I don't think any of us want to. But every now and then, I think about Cold Creek Lake and wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting for someone else to come too close. It was supposed to be a fun, low-key trip, just me and my brother, Nate, camping in the woods near our old family cabin. The place had been abandoned for years, but we still liked to hike there sometimes, drawn by the memories of summers spent running through those woods as kids. This trip was meant to be a little nostalgia, a break from our busy lives. We set up our camp about a mile from the cabin, far enough to feel like we were really out in the wilderness, but close enough to make the hike back easy if the weather turned. The first night was perfect. A sky full of stars, a crackling fire, and the comfort of being surrounded by trees we knew well. But the second night, that was when things got strange. It started with a sound. I woke up in the middle of the night to what I thought was a distant humming. It was soft, like a melody carried on the breeze, and I thought for a moment it might just be the wind. But then it grew louder, more distinct. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. It was a voice, someone singing. I nudged Nate awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, still half asleep. "Hear what?" "That singing, it's coming from the woods." Nate rubbed his eyes and sat up, listening. Sure enough, the soft, eerie melody drifted through the trees, distant but unmistakable. It sounded like a woman's voice, singing something slow and sad. "Who the hell would be out here?" he muttered, his voice tense. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped out of the tent, scanning the forest. The singing continued, always seeming just out of reach, like it was moving through the trees. We called out, but there was no response, just that haunting, wordless song echoing through the night. We decided to follow the sound, thinking maybe someone was lost or hurt. The forest was pitch black, and the singing seemed to get louder and fainter at random, like it was leading us somewhere, then pulling away. The deeper we went into the woods, the more the air felt heavy, thick with a damp chill that hadn't been there before. After about 20 minutes of walking, we came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it, the old cabin. We hadn't planned to come back here during the trip. The cabin was dilapidated, barely standing, and full of broken memories. But something about seeing it again in the dead of night sent a shiver down my spine. The singing had stopped as soon as we reached the clearing, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. "Let's check it out," Nate said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We walked toward the cabin, its roof caved in and windows shattered. I wasn't sure what we were looking for, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming.
Just as Nate reached for the door, it creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was colder than it had any right to be. We shone our flashlights around the cabin's interior. Dust-covered furniture, a rusted stove, broken glass on the floor, but no sign of anyone.
Then, from behind us, the singing started again. This time it was much closer, practically in our ears. We spun around, shining our flashlights toward the trees, but no one was there. My skin prickled with the sensation that something was very, very wrong. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nate nodded, and we turned to go back the way we came. But as soon as we stepped out of the cabin, the singing grew louder again, echoing from all directions, as if the forest itself was alive with that haunting lullaby. We ran. Branches scratched at our faces, and the cold seemed to press in on us from all sides. The path back to the campsite felt longer than it should have, and the whole time, that voice followed us, always just behind, always singing. When we finally burst back into the clearing where our tent was, the singing stopped again, leaving only the crackling of the dying fire. We didn't speak, didn't dare look back toward the woods. We packed up our things in silence, not even waiting for morning, and left. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was singing in the woods that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can still hear that lullaby, faint and distant, calling me back.